Hello, everyone. Good to see you back again. Except, of course, that I am not actually seeing you, nor are you really seeing or hearing me. This is a recorded video of my voice and these slides, recorded in advance. It's a one-way medium, so you can't actually communicate back at me, and you're not actually hearing me. You're hearing a recording of me. Or can you communicate back to me? If you look down below, you'll see a box where you can leave a comment. And if you do that, suddenly this becomes a whole new type of media experience for both of us because it's gone from a one-way transmission from me to you, separated in time, to a back and forth interaction. Now, needless to say, this is a huge step in terms of how we can think about and use media in instructional design and for teaching and learning. And as you can see from the title of this presentation, there are a lot of factors to cover, but I still want to keep this lecture brief and fairly to the point, so let's dive right in. So, I am very excited to get to this part of the course because finally we're arriving at my area of real expertise. Media and multimodal literacy is my more general area, but interactive media is my real specialty personally, specifically games and gamification. And so because of that, just to give you a heads up, a lot of the readings for the next couple of weeks come out of game studies because that is where I have the deepest well of resources to draw from and share with you. But you don't need to really know anything about games to do these readings, and the underlying design ideas apply to all the different kinds of interactive media you see listed over here on the right. So anytime you read the word game this week or next week, you can just mentally change it to app or social media or simulation or online classroom if you want to, and the design ideas will still work. So don't worry if you don't necessarily understand some of the game-specific examples. Just focus on the design concepts being discussed. One other minor note while we're talking about different kinds of interactive media, our focus in this discussion for the next 2 weeks will be on digital media for a number of reasons which I think are fairly obvious. But interactive media don't have to be online. They can be analog, just like other kinds of media. The molecule modeling kits that Dave uses to teach his chemistry students, those are interactive media. The STEAM kits or craft kits that you can check out from the library, at least from my library, those could be considered interactive media. A board game or an escape room, these are examples of interactive media. So we're mostly going to stick to digital examples in this discussion and in the readings I'm presenting, but you don't have to stay digital in your lesson plans or your other responses to interactive media. So, obviously, interactive media, as I'm presenting it here, is a fairly broad and diverse category covering all of these different types of things and more besides. But the feature that all of these things have in common is that you as the reader can actually interact with them and change them, literally change things about the media themselves, which you cannot generally do with traditional media like graphics or audio or video. No matter how many times you reread a book or rewatch a movie, it's still exactly the same as it was the first time. Now, your interpretation, your cognitive experience, and even the things you notice in your perceptual experience might change over time, but the overall perceptual experience, what you literally perceive about the media object, is always the same. But with interactive media, potentially every time you go back, you're going to encounter something new. Not just something you didn't notice before, but something really actually new based on what you do, the actions you take with the media object, and how it processes those actions and produces feedback. So that's the key word, is feedback. Now, as teachers and instructional designers, we already know a lot about feedback. It's a huge part of what we do. But the difference now is we're asking ourselves, what if the media that we're using itself could start doing some of that feedback for us? Which, needless to say, is a big jump in our design thinking. So, bear feedback in mind, and we'll circle back to it in a minute, but to get there, we need to hit a couple other things first, starting with conventions. So this is the last major piece of affordance theory, and this piece is all about expectations. If you look at these three little buttons here, you already know what they do without me having to tell you because of conventions. So on the left is minimize, in the middle is full screen or maximize, and on the right is close. And you know that because that's what those buttons have done in every app or computer program that you've ever used. Now, there's nothing about these icons that actually has an inherent or structural relationship to those actions. And if I'm a computer programmer, I could in fact make those buttons do whatever I wanted. De Saussure's semiotic theory is all about conventions. He loves to point out that words only mean things because we agree that they do. There's no natural relationship between the sounds that I'm making and the thoughts that you're having. It's all based on conventions that we have learned and internalized through our shared cultural setting. Now, in design, conventions don't actually directly affect our actions and interactions the way that affordances or constraints do. But what they can do is communicate information about the affordances and constraints that are there. So if, for example, I see these three buttons somewhere on a computer screen, I now know something about the affordances of the program, that I can change the size of the window or exit out of the program if I want to. So that's very valuable, especially in interactive media, where I am no longer just perceiving a set arrangement of signs and signifiers, but to read these media, I have to take action and do things that are going to produce the feedback that will communicate the information to me that I want, hopefully. So as a designer, you need your audience to have the same understanding of conventions that you do, or your job is going to be much, much harder. So hang on to that as well for another moment, conventions, and keep hanging on to feedback also. And then there's one more piece before we tie it all together. And by one more piece, I mean three more pieces. This is the mechanics, dynamics, aesthetics framework, which was originally proposed as a game design framework, but has since been adopted by designers in all kinds of other interactive media and interactive systems, including instructional design. And it is useful because it gives us a way to examine a design from both directions, in our case, from the perspective of an instructional designer or a teacher, and also to examine the same design from the perspective of a student. You'll be reading the original paper on this framework this week, which has plenty more detail. So for now, we'll go through these levels quickly, and then we'll tie all our new design vocabulary together at the end. Starting off at mechanics, these are the basic building blocks a designer has to work with. For programmers, this is code. For game designers, this is rules. For film editors, this is the mechanical cuts. And for us, it's all the basic facts and data that we use as inputs and outputs to create feedback and to plan, deliver, and assess lessons. My slightly flippant definition is that anything you can put in a spreadsheet or a gradebook, that's a mechanic. Just individual nuts and bolts that either go into or come out of instruction. Then, as mechanics come together and you start to outline complete interactions and patterns in your design, now you're at the level of dynamics. If mechanics are just raw pieces of data, then dynamics are usable information that allow you to describe interactions in full. Basically, this is the whole input-output feedback loop from a couple slides ago all at once. So you can see how things connect and how somebody is interacting with a media object all the way through, from that initial action through what changes that produces and output that produces to what the feedback is that the student or user receives and how that shapes their next action. So dynamics are really the level that this course is primarily focused on, because this is where observable feedback happens. So in instructional design, the lesson plan is really a good example, maybe the best example of a dynamic you're going to get. And this is also the level where you set objectives and you make predictions about how a design will work, how you expect your students to interact with the lesson design you've created, or at least how you hope it will work. And then you compare the interactions you observe with what you were expecting and evaluate the design based on how successful that was. The second article I'm having you read this week, the one by Nicholson, which a couple of you who took my gamification class last year will remember, is all about dynamics, and it gives 6 different learning dynamics that can be created using game mechanics in this case. But again, remember that the underlying dynamics can apply to all different kinds of interactive media and learning and instructional designs as well. So as you read, think about how those different dynamics might look in your classroom, with or without the game flavor. How would you design a lesson to create a particular dynamic, like reflection or choice? And what dynamics do you think you generally favor as a designer? Everyone has certain dynamics that they really like to default to. Now, Nicholson's list isn't any kind of an exhaustive list of learning dynamics. You can try to create many dynamics as an instructional designer, but it's a good example of breaking down different kinds of dynamics and different ways of using interactive media to guide learning based on what you as a designer or a teacher want to do. And finally, just like dynamics are created out of patterns and arrangements of mechanics, aesthetics emerge from overall patterns of dynamics. In the paper you'll be reading that originally laid out this framework, they identify 8 major game aesthetics. Plenty of other people have added to or tweaked that list, but again, this is just an illustration of the possibilities you can try to produce of a range of different aesthetics that you could try to create in your classroom. In instructional design, I think the best way to consider aesthetics is as classroom culture. Some classes are challenging and competitive, some are creative, some are social, some are boring. And this aesthetic level is the overall experience students will have, and you can look at it through all these different lenses of social or emotional or intellectual experience, but it's the overall impression the design creates. And the aesthetic is the piece that students really remember and that they carry with them over time, and that shapes their whole attitude towards a class and their memory of a class and towards a teacher as well. And this is what makes the MDA framework useful, because as teachers and designers, we're starting from the mechanics end of things. These are our basic tools that we're using to try and design instruction and to create dynamics and eventually aesthetics. But a lot of that seems really important and obvious to us is basically invisible to students. They see the aesthetic first and above all else. And so to understand a design from that perspective, that's where we have to start too. And then try to work backwards and understand how we arrive at the aesthetic we want from the mechanics and dynamics we're actually building and working with. So now, like I promised, we're going to tie all this new design vocabulary together: conventions and feedbacks and mechanics, dynamics, aesthetics. So conventions exist at all 3 levels of this framework, as do affordances and constraints for that matter. And this is really important for understanding and predicting how different people will interact with designs and with interactive media objects. At the mechanical and dynamical level, this is how we communicate with other designers. This is literally what we are going to be doing when we start group workshopping your projects. And so if two people are not on the same page about what a student essay, for example, should look like, if they don't have a shared conventional understanding of the affordances and constraints of the essay form as an assessment, then that's going to be a bit of a speed bump in communicating and giving feedback on each other's work. It's not necessarily a major problem, but it's something to bear in mind. The major problem comes when the teacher and the student don't share the same conventions with regards to dynamics in the classroom, or even worse, don't share the same aesthetic conventions. If you have a different idea about what makes a good essay than your students do, then that's a pretty serious obstacle for all of you. And it's even worse if the mismatch is at the aesthetic level, where you are trying to create a particular class culture and your students are perceiving a totally different culture. I'll share an example. This happens to me frequently. I'm a design thinker, obviously. I don't generally see things in terms of right or wrong answers, at least not in instructional design. I think there are different approaches, and what really matters is understanding how and why people are making decisions in that environment. Like, I assign projects, not tests, because I'm more interested in the process, not in answering things a specific way. So I'll grade a project with a comment like, why are you doing this way? And the student comes back to me asking, what's wrong about this? And what's the way that I should do it in the final draft? And I say, it's not necessarily that it's wrong, I just want you to think about this decision and be able to explain it. And then they say, but what's the right answer? And I say, there isn't a right answer, but you have to prove to me that this is the right answer in context for you and your design. And then eventually they hand in the revised draft, and they've changed that thing because what they heard me say was, this is wrong, even though that's not what I was trying to say. And the change actually makes the design worse. And then I feel sad. So this is the real difficulty with designing and using interactive media, because it's all dependent on that feedback loop in order to work. But if the feedback is coming out in a form that students don't understand, they don't have the conventional language to interpret it the way you expect, then they can really just not even notice the feedback you're giving at all. You might think you're communicating very clearly and the mechanics are obvious to everybody. And meanwhile, your students are genuinely oblivious. They do not perceive what you were doing at all. And the feedback they think they're getting has nothing to do with what you were trying to say. And so this now finally ties back to conventions and communicating clearly about the affordances and constraints available in a design. If you don't have that, it will be extremely difficult to do anything with interactive media, or any media really. So you have to start by making sure that your class is operating with a shared set of conventions so that everybody understands the feedback and the inputs and outputs, and you're using media in a way that represents your intended message accurately at whatever level you're working at. So that's all very complicated, but if you do it right and establish clear conventions, then you can get your students to understand affordances and constraints almost automatically. And that can really streamline and enhance learning, like Salman Khan was hoping was going to happen in his video from the beginning of this week's readings. So on that note, I'll leave you for now. You have 3 articles to read about games, but they're really about interactive media more generally, so just once again, don't forget that. And then for this week's check-in, I'm hoping for some funny stories about a time when you just weren't seeing the same feedback as either a teacher or a student, when the conventions of interaction just didn't line up right and led, hopefully, to laughter and eventually increased understanding in the end. That's all for now, but obviously there's a lot more to uncover about this topic, so stay tuned and I will talk to you again soon.